The house on Wren Street had been empty for 7 years before Lo and Karis moved in. Not abandoned, just avoided. The paint was chipped, the windows heavy with dust, and the floorboard side even when no one walked on them. She liked that. It sounded tired, like her. She hadn't meant to buy a house alone. She hadn't meant to start over at all. But grief is a kind of storm that rewrites your map. And one day she simply found herself signing her name at the bottom of a contract she barely read. Hands trembling, heart quiet. Iloan didn't notice him the first week. Thorn did. He'd been dead for 52 years. Give or take. He didn't keep count anymore. There were no clocks where he drifted. Only the rhythm of the house breathing around him. When the first family left, he'd felt a soft kind of regret. When the second left in the middle of the night, terrified after their child claimed a man in the hallway hummed lullabies. He hadn't tried to stop them. He didn't mean to be frightening. He just was. But Iloan was different. She moved like someone made of water and shadow. Quiet, careful, kind of objects. She spoke to herself often, not as though mad, but as though she didn't trust silence to carry the weight alone. The first time she spoke to him, she didn't know she was doing it. It was raining, soft, persistent, the kind of rain that stains window panes with memory. She was sitting on the floor with an open box of books, trying to decide which ones were worth keeping. "I don't know why I brought these," she said aloud. "It's not like anyone reads these kind of stories anymore." Thorn, listening from the rafters, tilted toward the sound, not startled, just curious. Iloan looked around. "Well," she added, a wry smile tugging at her lips, "unless you're a ghost, in which case I apologize for the mess." Something in the air shifted. Not cold, not spectral, just gently aware. She kept talking after that. Sometimes small things, commentary on recipes, which drawer to use, where to hang the fern, and sometimes the heavier stuff, memories, regrets, pieces of the past she never named in full. But Thorn came to understand by tone alone. She missed someone. She feared loneliness more than ghosts. And she hated silence, not because it was empty, but because it was too full. Thorn began to answer in the only ways he could. A window that wouldn't latch suddenly stayed shut. A misplaced spoon appeared on the counter. A light flickered, not ominous, just enough to draw attention to a journal she left half buried under blankets. At first, she chalked it up to her own forgetfulness. Then one night, half dreaming, she whispered, "If someone's here, thank you." Thorn froze. No one had spoken to him in decades. Not like that. He sat near the radiator until sunrise, watching her breathe. Days passed, then weeks. He became a part of her rhythm, and she a part of his. She began leaving one lamp on when she left. "For the house," she'd say, smiling faintly. Sometimes she left music playing. Once, she left a piece of chocolate on the windowsill. He couldn't taste it, but he understood the gesture. Iloan began sleeping better, laughing more, talking aloud as if she were never alone. And Thorn, for the first time since he died, wondered what it might have felt like to be alive, if someone like her had waited for him in the quiet. Iloan started to notice patterns. It wasn't the draft or the creaking floorboards or even the hum that came from the hallway when the world was too quiet. It was the timing, the light that flickered only when she said she was afraid, the kettle that clicked off right before it boiled over, the misplaced photographs that somehow ended up rearranged into a better order, not alphabetically, but emotionally. She didn't believe in ghosts. Not really, but she believed in attention. And the house on Wren Street was definitely paying attention to her. She began to test it. One night, she stood at the foot of the stairs, wineglass in hand, and asked, "Did you hear that poem I read earlier? The one about the candle that refused burnout?" A pause. Then the hallway light flickered once, soft, like a nod, Eloan smiled. I thought so. Thorn hovered on the landing above her, invisible and aching. He didn't know when the ache had started. Maybe the day she called the house kind. Maybe the night she said half asleep, I'm glad it's you, whoever you are. Or maybe it was simply the way she looked at the rooms, not as a shell or a ruin, but as something trying to be whole again. He began to leave signs. Not enough to frighten, just to answer. The scent of rain in the kitchen, her favorite kind of weather, even when the skies were dry. A pencil she thought she lost placed neatly on her notebook. One morning, a line written in fog on the bathroom mirror. Yes, I heard the poem. Eloan didn't scream. She laughed, quiet and stunned. Thank you, she whispered. I think I needed to know I wasn't just talking to emptiness. Thorn drifted back to the walls, feeling something impossible flutter in what used to be a heart. She began to talk to him by name, a name, she guessed, made up on a whim. I feel like you might be a thorn, she said one evening while cooking pasta. Not a scary one, the kind that comes with roses, the kind that's sharp only because it's protecting something soft. He almost wept. That night, she left a second pillow on the couch. She said, in case you feel like resting near people again. He did. They began living around each other like tide and shore, never colliding, always shaping. She played music he didn't know, but came to adore. He guided her away from spots on the floor that would have made her trip. She told him stories of her childhood. He opened the curtain each morning just before she stirred. One morning, she placed her hand gently against the wall near the stairwell and said, You know, you're the first presence I've trusted in a long time. He wanted to respond, to speak, but he couldn't. Not yet. Instead, the wind stirred the curtain like a breath, and she smiled. It began with thunder, not distant, not dramatic, but close, as if the sky had bent down and whispered its grief directly into the rafters. Eloan had been fine all morning. Or at least, she had pretended well enough. She made tea, washed dishes, hummed to herself while she swept the kitchen floor. But Thorn could feel it, in the way she moved too carefully, in the tremble behind her hum, in the way she avoided the hallway with the old mirror. The storm rolled in fast. By mid-afternoon, the rain hit the windows like it had a purpose, and Eloan unraveled. Not loudly, not in the way books described. She just sat down in the hallway, back to the wall, legs pulled in, arms wrapped tightly around herself like she was trying to keep her soul from spilling onto the floor. Thorn hovered in the doorway, helpless. She didn't cry right away. She just stared at the mirror and finally whispered, It's been a year. 1 year since she'd lost him. The man whose name she hadn't said aloud in months. The man whose toothbrush still lived in a drawer she couldn't open. I thought I'd be better by now, she said, laughing through it. I don't know what I thought. The house creaked softly, not the usual complaint of age, but something else. Something like sorrow. Thorn had never known how to comfort the living. He had watched generations come and go. He had watched sorrow rot walls and joy brighten ceilings. But never had he wanted so desperately to reach someone as he did now. He tried everything. A breeze across her cheek, a blanket lifted, then dropped beside her like a suggestion. A song, her song, playing faintly through the old record player in the corner. Even though no one had touched it, Eloan looked up, lips parted. The house breathed. And finally, she said, You're here, aren't you? Thorn moved closer, not with footsteps, but with presence. I don't know how or why or what you even are, but I don't feel alone. She reached out, hand trembling. Fingers brushed empty air. And yet, she closed her eyes and leaned her head back, and the wind curled around her like arms. Thorn wrapped himself around her, not seen, not heard, but felt. And for one long moment, the house held them both. The mirror fogged gently behind her. Words appeared, slow and tender. You don't have to be better. Just be. She didn't question it. She just nodded, tears falling freely now, not in sorrow, but in relief. That night, she fell asleep on the floor with the blanket tucked around her, the record player still spinning silence. And Thorn sat beside her, watching the storm ease its grip on the sky. Outside, the rain slowed. Inside, for the first time in years, the house on Wren Street slept without weeping. The mirror in the hallway had always unnerved Eloan, but not for the usual reasons. It didn't distort her face. It didn't show shadows that weren't there. It simply felt watched, as though every time she passed it, the reflection paused a second too long, like it was listening. She started leaving candles beneath it, not for light, for comfort. One night, she sat in front of it cross-legged, sipping tea, and said softly, "You've been here a long time, haven't you?" The mirror remained still. The room was quiet, but something in the temperature changed, like a held breath. "I think you want to be known," she continued, "and I think I'm ready to ask." She reached into her pocket and took out the old skeleton key she'd found weeks ago, wedged into the floorboards of the upstairs bedroom. She cleaned it, but never figured out what it opened. Now, holding it in the flickering candlelight, she felt a hum. The mirror fogged again, gently, like breath on glass. A single word appeared. "Thorn." She smiled. "I guessed right." The fog rippled. Another word followed. "Attic." Eloan stood slowly. Her heart beat strangely, not in fear, but in anticipation. She had lived with this presence for months now. She had spoken to it, leaned on it, cried in its quiet company. But now she wanted more. She wanted to understand. She climbed the creaking stairs, key in hand, the moonlight casting narrow bars of silver through the windows. The attic door, which had always stuck, now opened easily. Inside, it smelled like cedar and forgotten letters. She found the chest in the corner. Dusty, brass hinges dull with time. The key fit. Inside, letters. Sketches. A journal with a cracked leather spine. And at the bottom, an old photograph, the kind that yellowed at the corners. A man with storm-dark eyes. A face she knew, somehow, though she'd never seen it in life. "Thorn," she whispered. She read the journal slowly, sitting cross-legged in moonlight. His handwriting was neat, thoughtful. A schoolteacher, widowed young, lived in the house alone, never remarried, loved poetry, described the house as aching with silence but too proud to crumble. She reached the final page. The ink trembled, different than the rest. "If anyone ever finds this, I hope you speak kindly to the walls. They remember more than people think." Eloan closed the book and pressed her hand against the floorboards. "I hope you know you're not alone anymore." Downstairs, the mirror cleared. No fog, just a reflection. And behind her, for a moment, a flicker of a second one. Not frightening, just present. And watching her with a kind of expression that can only form after decades of being unseen. That night, she left the journal open on the table. She whispered, "You're remembered." And for the first time since she arrived on Wren Street, she dreamed of a man with soft eyes who stood beside her as if he always had. The morning after the attic, Eloan moved slower, not from fear, not even from sorrow, but from reverence. She had spent the night rereading Thorn's journal, touching the past with fingertips that felt more like hands reaching forward. He wasn't just a presence anymore. He was someone, a man who once lived, who once lost, who once looked out the same window she did now and wrote, "Loneliness is heaviest in the quiet hours after dusk." So she filled the house with music. Old records, soft guitar, her voice quiet and imperfect, humming in the kitchen. She read aloud from books, left notes near the mirror, sometimes silly, sometimes sweet. And in turn, the house began to breathe differently. Thorne's presence grew bolder, not frightening but curious. The air around Aloan warmed slightly when she entered a room. Lights dimmed when she spoke of missing someone. And once, when she tripped while watering plants, an unseen force caught the vase mid-fall. She froze, then laughed. Nice catch, Thorne. In the mirror that evening, the word always appeared. It became a rhythm, a life not quite shared but overlapped. She danced barefoot across creaky floorboards, and the record never skipped. She spoke to the air as though he might answer, and sometimes he did, through flickers or scribbles or the faint, lovely scent of rain-soaked wood. One rainy afternoon, she placed a book of poetry on the old armchair in the parlor. "I think you like this one," she said. When she returned hours later, a corner was turned down, page 42. She opened it. It read, "You arrived when I've forgotten how to wait." And Aloan, heart caught somewhere between ache and awe, whispered, "I don't know what this is, but I think I care for you." That night, the mirror fogged with a single word, "Stay." Thorne had never tried to speak so clearly before. It cost him something. That much he could feel. The veil between them was still thick, stitched together by rules he didn't understand. But he was learning. He was living. Not in the way he once had, with pulse and breath, but in presence, in memory, in the way he was now known. And Aloan, she was blooming. She spoke with more conviction, laughed more easily, wrote again, painted small watercolors she left in odd corners of the house, her way of saying, "I see you." Still, they began to occupy the same spaces more intentionally. She read aloud at night. He turned the pages. She cried, once quietly in the hallway, and something unseen tucked the blanket around her shoulders. They weren't alive together, but they were no longer apart. And Thorne, once lost to silence, once dissolved into dust and floorboards, now found himself wondering if love, when built slowly and seen honestly, might just be enough to anchor even the dead. Spring crept into Wren Street like a secret. Soft wind through cracked windows. Sunlight stretched across the hardwood floor like golden lace. Aloan moved through the house differently now. She no longer paused to question whether Thorne was real. She knew. She knew by the way the room settled when she entered, by the warmth at her back when she read aloud, by the flicker of candlelight whenever she said his name. But knowing was no longer enough. One morning, she reached out, palm pressed flat against a mirror, and whispered, "I wish I could see you." There was no fog this time, no words, just a reflection of herself, and a single breath of warm air on her wrist. She didn't pull away. Neither did he. The distance between them had become a presence of its own, not a wall, but a veil, one she could almost see through if the light was right, one he could almost reach through if the ache was strong enough. That afternoon, she stood in the garden trimming ivy from the crumbling stone wall and whispered, "Would you want to be alive again, Thorne?" Inside, the mirror fogged with one word, "Yes." Later, he erased it, as if ashamed, as if hope was too heavy a thing for a ghost to carry. But Aloan held on to it like a prayer. She spent nights researching local folklore, old books, rituals whispered between the lines. Not summoning, not resurrection, just bridging, finding where stories said love had thinned the veil between realms. She found one passage in a battered book of superstitions. Where the living speak love without fear and the dead listen without longing, light may gather in the space between, and the soul may remember its shape. She didn't understand all of it, but she understood the first part. and she said it aloud every night. I love you, Thorn, not out of pity, not because I'm lonely, but because in all your silence, you've listened to me in ways no one else ever has. The mirror responded slowly, this time with 2 words. I remember. After that, things began to change. The sun lingered longer on Thorn's chair. Shadows moved slower. Sometimes, Alolan would glance across the room and catch something, not a shape, but a sense. The outline of a man just out of focus. The hint of a shoulder. A curl of dark hair against the window pane before it vanished. He was becoming visible. Not always. Not clearly. But enough. One evening, just before dusk, she looked up from her sketchbook and saw a hand, translucent, resting on the back of her chair. Long fingers. Familiar. She didn't startle. She simply reached her hand back, and for one breathless moment, he touched her. Light bloomed around her fingers, soft and silvery, like moonlight given form. He pulled away gently, but she wept. Not from sorrow, from confirmation. He was here, becoming, not through spell or miracle, but through the slow, honest gravity of love that refused to let him stay forgotten. It was Alolan who said it first. Thorn's name, out loud, in daylight, with no mirror and no candlelight. Just her voice, her breath, her body wrapped in a knit shawl as she stood barefoot in the garden, whispering. Thorn. And the garden listened. The wind pulled the ivy upward. The old weather vane turned slowly, though the air was still. She waited, not for a sign, just for the silence that would follow, not empty, but inhabited. He had never been so present during the day. But since the touch, since the light bloomed from their fingers, something had shifted. She could feel him near constantly now, as if her love had sketched him into the corners of every room. The house had changed, too. It grew warmer, not physically, but in spirit. Birds began nesting in the eaves again. Flowers she hadn't planted bloomed near the windowsills. And visitors, rare as they were, always paused when they stepped to the front door, squinting like they'd walked through a curtain of wind. "Do you keep incense burning?" one asked. "No," Alolan said softly. "Just kindness." She had started sketching him. From memory. Or maybe not memory, maybe instinct. The curve of his cheekbone, the set of his jaw, the way she imagined his eyes would crease when he smiled. She pinned the sketches to the wall behind the couch, whispered to them, "Come closer." And slowly, the sketches began to change. Just slightly. His gaze sharpened, his mouth softened, his expression turned toward her. She wasn't surprised. Neither was he. But the outside world was beginning to take notice. Neighbors murmured about shadows in the upstairs windows. Someone walking past the house swore they saw a man open the curtain, even though Alolan was in the garden at the time. "I think you've got a tenant," one joked. Alolan just smiled. "He's been here a long time." That night, she sat by the window, holding the same journal she'd found in the attic, and read it aloud. And when she said his name a second time, Thorn, the mirror fogged, but not with a word, with a reflection. His, not clear, not lasting, but him, eyes the color of dusk, mouth parted like he was trying to say something but hadn't learned how yet. She didn't cry this time. She just whispered, "You don't have to rush. I'll wait." From the wall, one of the sketches fell. She caught it before it hit the ground. And on the back, in unfamiliar handwriting, was a message. "So will I?" It happened during golden hour. That strange, soft stretch of time just before dusk, where the whole world looks as though it remembers being a dream. Alolan had just finished rearranging her books, a ritual she returned to when the air felt too still. As she passed the hallway mirror, she paused, not because of what she saw, but because of what she felt. He was standing in the doorway, not in shadow, not in flicker, but almost real. Thorn. His form was blurred around the edges, like a photograph half-developed. But his eyes, they were unmistakably his, watching her, wanting to step closer, wanting to speak. She turned toward him, heart caught in her throat, and whispered, "You're really here." He didn't nod. He didn't move. He just stayed in the doorway, like something tethered. And then the doorway began to change. It shimmered, softly, like heat rising from pavement or light reflecting off water. She blinked, and for a moment she saw beyond it. Not the kitchen, not the stairs. Something else. A field, a sky filled with unfamiliar stars. A world that pulsed with stillness. It wasn't heaven. It wasn't death. It was release. Thorn stood on the edge of it, and she knew the house, her, had brought him to this, had given him enough warmth, enough memory, enough love to become complete again, to choose. She stepped closer. Tears slipped down her cheeks, not from fear, not even from loss, from understanding. "This is your door, isn't it?" she said. The light shimmered. The edges of him grew more defined. He looked at her, not with sorrow, but with gratitude. "You don't have to go," she whispered. "But if you do, I'll be okay. I promise." He stepped forward, one step out of the doorframe, then stopped. The house held its breath. She reached out her hand, open, trembling, and he reached back. For a moment, a real moment, their hands touched. Warm, solid, impossible. She smiled through her tears. "You're not a haunting." His lips parted, and this time she heard it. Soft, fragile, real. "No," he said. "I'm a home." Then the shimmer faded. The door frame became wood again. The light stilled. He was gone, not vanished, just gone. She stood in silence for a long while, then turned back to mirror. Nothing appeared, but the air felt full. She poured 2 cups of tea that evening, like always, sat by the window, and though no one else would see it, she smiled when the steam from the second cup curled toward her hand, because some love doesn't ask to be held. It just asks to be let go, gently, with the promise that it was never unloved. The house was quiet again, but not empty. Eloan moved through the rooms like someone still listening. She no longer spoke aloud as often, not because she no longer believed he was there, but because some silences don't need filling. They're shared. They're sacred. She still kept the second teacup on the table, still lit the candle by the mirror at twilight, still paused at the stairwell where once, long ago, the air had held warmth in the shape of a man who had never meant to be remembered, and yet had been completely. Neighbors came by more often now. They said the house had changed, felt open, comforting, like a place that already knew your name. Eloan would smile, hand them tea, and let them sit in the sunroom, where the light fell just right in the afternoons, the very place she'd first felt Thorn shift from echo to presence. She began writing. Not stories, not at first. Letters. Letters to no one and everyone. She slipped them into books, drawers, flower pots, folded them into the soil of her tiny garden, left them between the beams of the attic. Words like, "You are not too much. You are not invisible. You are allowed to grieve and still love again." She did not sign them. The house did. Visitors who stayed too long would often say strange things, things Eloan had once said herself. "I feel like something in this house is rooting for me. I swear I heard a voice tell me to try again. I had a dream last night, and he was in it." She never asked who he was. She didn't need to. She painted again. Small canvases, soft things, doorways that shimmered, windows with no walls. silhouettes that stood just behind the frame, watching but never stepping in. The townsfolk began calling the house kind. Somehow, that felt like the most accurate word anyone had ever chosen. One child, no older than 7, once looked up at Aloan while visiting and asked, "Is this house magic?" And she, with eyes too wise for her years and a voice that had learned to carry pain gently, said, "No, but it remembers what it's like to be lonely, and it never wants anyone to feel that way again." She still missed him, sometimes terribly, especially on soft days, especially when she read poetry. But grief no longer lived in her like a wound. It lived like a room, open, sunlit, waiting for stories to be placed gently inside. And if she sometimes heard footsteps in the attic when there should have been none, if she sometimes woke to find her sketchbook moved, if the mirror sometimes fogged for no reason at all, she simply smiled and said, "I'm glad you're still here," because the house on Wren Street had once held a ghost, and now it held a legacy. It was an ordinary spring morning when Aloan decided to finally clear out the attic, not for any practical reason. The space had long since become more memory than storage, its corners filled with boxes of yellowed pages, old furniture, half-empty sketchbooks, and the kind of forgotten things that somehow felt sacred just for having survived. She didn't expect to find anything new, but then she moved a broken picture frame and noticed a draft behind one of the wood panels, barely visible beneath the slant of the ceiling. She felt the faintest rush of cool air, a loose board. She pried it back with careful hands, half prepared to find only dust and spiderwebs. Instead, she found a small wooden box, simple, unmarked, bound with a faded strip of linen. Inside, letters, dozens of them, each addressed, sealed, but never sent, each signed with a name she now knew intimately. Thorne A. Hale. Her breath caught as she opened the first one. "Dear Jameson," it began, "I've written this so many times I can no longer count. I still remember the sound of your laugh in the garden. I don't think I've heard anything so alive since." Aloan sat down on the attic floor, sunlight falling over her shoulder in a soft slant, and began to read. Letter after letter, name after name. Some were meant for old friends, some for students he had once taught, many for people long gone. But a few, a precious few, were for no one in particular. Those ones broke her the most. "To whoever lives here next, I hope you are kinder to the quiet than I was. To the one who finds this house too big to fill, may you discover that silence is not emptiness, but space waiting to be heard. And finally, to the woman I'll never meet, may you bring this house back to life, one breath at a time. I hope I do not frighten you. I only ever wanted to be known." Aloan wept then, not the kind of tears that ache, the kind that release. She placed the letters back in the box, then carried it downstairs, not to hide them away again, but to place them on the writing desk by the window. She created a small shelf for them, labeled it Echoes. Sometimes she would read one aloud at night. Sometimes she would answer them with her own letters, folded gently and slipped in among his. She never asked how she knew he could still read them. She just knew, because grief, love, longing, these were not feelings bound by time. They were letters that never expire. And Aloan had learned how to read them. It was late autumn when the knock came. Not urgent, not hesitant, just quiet, like someone unsure if they belonged. Aloan had stopped expecting visitors. The few who knew her routine rarely came unannounced. Still, she wiped her hands on her apron and opened the door. A young man stood on the step, mid-20s perhaps, backpack slung over one shoulder, paint flecks on his sleeves, a notebook bulging with loose pages tucked under one arm. "Hi," he said. I think I'm supposed to be here." Aloan tilted her head. "Do you have an appointment?" He shook his head. No, just the feeling. She studied him, pale-eyed, exhausted, carrying something invisible but heavy, like he hadn't spoken a full truth in years. She stepped aside. Then come in. The house likes wanderers. He moved through the threshold like someone exhaling for the first time in days. She made tea. He sat near the window, and after a long pause, he asked, "Did someone ever live here who wasn't alive?" She didn't flinch. "His name was Thorn," she said softly. He used to watch storms from that chair. The young man's eyes filled, not with fear, but recognition. "I thought I was going mad," he said. "There's something that follows me, but not like a shadow. It's kind. It listens. It makes the lights flicker when I doubt myself." Eloan nodded slowly. Some love doesn't leave. It waits, especially for those who forget they're worth being watched over. They spent hours talking about art, about silence, about grief that feels too quiet to share. He showed her a sketch. A man standing by a window, blurred at the edges. She smiled. He has a way of finding kind hearts. For the next 3 days, he stayed in the upstairs guest room. He didn't ask if he could. The house didn't mind. He painted again, not for galleries, but for himself. On the last night, he sat in front of the fireplace and whispered, "I didn't know I needed a witness." Eloan placed a folded letter beside him, in her own handwriting. "We all do." When he left, he kissed her cheek and said, "You're not a ghost, but you haunt in the best way." She laughed. "That's what Thorne said to me once. In a mirror." He smiled, then turned back to the threshold. As he crossed it, the front door gently pulled itself closed behind him. Eloan turned back to the room. The fire still crackled. The air was still warm. And from the corner of the room, the mirror fogged with 2 words. "You're ready?" She didn't ask for what. She already knew. Stop sign paused. Years passed in soft, uncounted ways. Eloan grew older, not frail, not faded, just quieter in her bones. Her hair turned to silver, her hands to parchment, but her eyes still held every color of grief and every light that had followed it. The house aged with her. Together they softened. Together they waited. The sketchbooks on the shelf filled one by one. Letters written by her, by visitors, by those who once cried on her staircase or laughed in her kitchen, now lined the walls in ribbon-bound bundles. She kept them not out of sentimentality, but out of reverence. This was never just a house. It was a sanctuary for stories. One morning, slow, golden, birdsong rising gently through the windows, Eloan rose, made tea, and walked barefoot through each room. She didn't speak. She didn't write. She simply remembered. In the upstairs hallway, she paused by the mirror. It was dusted now, untouched for weeks. But when she passed it, her reflection paused. Only for a moment, and behind her, just barely, a familiar silhouette stood watching, not reaching, not waiting, just there. She smiled. "Hello, love." No fog, no words, just light. She made her way to the writing desk and placed a final envelope beside the journal she had once found in the attic. On the front, in steady, beautiful script, "For the one who finds themselves here." Inside, a letter. "This house remembers. Not in a way that haunts, in a way that holds." If you're reading this, you've likely already felt it. The presence, the pulse, the kindness that cannot be explained. Let it in. Speak out loud. Be soft here. And if you find yourself longing, grieving, or trying to come again, you are welcome. There is room here for you. There always has been. She left the front door unlocked. Not wide open, just unlatched. Then she sat in her favorite chair and watched the sun rise. They found her that afternoon, A peaceful passing, nothing dramatic, just the hush of someone who had made peace with every ghost in her bones. The house did not creak for 3 days. It listened. The next week, a girl arrived. 23, lost, carrying an old backpack and a sketchbook full of stars. She paused on the threshold, felt something warm move across her chest like memory, then stepped inside. A letter was waiting for her. So was the mirror, and somewhere, just past the light, a room filled with silence that was not empty, but expectant. She hadn't meant to stay. The girl, 23, rail-thin with calloused fingers and paint beneath her nails, had only intended to stop in for the night. A layover, a breath, a place to collect herself before she vanished again into whatever came next. But then she stepped inside the house on Wren Street, and something deep in her ribcage shifted, like a door creaked open where none had been. The air was different here. It didn't demand anything. It didn't expect. It simply received. The letter on the desk greeted her like a whisper. She read it twice, then pressed it to her chest, though she didn't quite know why. She wandered the room slowly, fingertips trailing across windowsills and worn banisters. The walls didn't speak. The floor didn't creak. But something watched. Something warm. Something that had waited long enough to know better than to rush her. So she stayed. 1 night became 3. 3 became 10. Soon she stopped counting. She swept the porch, repaired the cracked tiles in the bathroom, rearranged the books by color instead of author, just to see what happened. Nothing did, but the house felt amused. She began to dream again, vivid, strange dreams filled with music and the scent of firewood and the sound of laughter she knew she'd never heard in waking life. She stopped painting for weeks, then started again. The first canvas she finished was a house. Not this one exactly, but close. It had the same breath, the same spine. She pinned it to the wall in the sunroom, where the light hit just so. Then she spoke, just once, to no one, to everything. I think I was meant to find this place. That night, a candle in the hallway flickered and held its flame higher than usual, steady and still, like an affirmation. She didn't know who Lowen was. She didn't need to. She felt her in the placement of the blankets, the gentle curve of the old armchair, the journal left behind on the desk with the last entry reading, "If someone stays, let them stay." Some houses are meant to be kept alive. She made no promises. She just didn't leave. Weeks turned to seasons. People began stopping by. Friends of Lowen's, strangers, people who looked lost but left differently. She didn't offer explanations. She offered tea. And sometimes when the wind curled down the stairwell just so, she whispered, "I'm still listening." And the house listened back. It began with a draft, a cold breath that lingered near the floorboards of the upstairs study, a space she rarely entered, mostly because it felt too quiet even for this house. But that day the girl, who still hadn't told anyone her name, sat on a windowsill with a cup of mint tea and noticed something odd. A small floorboard, warped slightly upward as though nudged from beneath. She waited. The house, true to itself, gave no instruction, so she fetched a screwdriver. The plank lifted with a gentle groan, not resistant, but tired. Beneath it, dust, dry petals, and a tightly bound parcel wrapped in oilskin. She hesitated before touching it, not from fear, from reverence. This felt like something left for her, not just before her. Inside were letters. Old, brittle, edges faded from time and damp. But the ink still clung to the pages like breath that had refused to leave. They weren't from Thorn, and they weren't from a Lowen. The handwriting was spikier, more uncertain, younger, each letter signed. R. Some dated as far back as 1912. They spoke of hunger and poetry. of losing someone to war, of a sister who vanished in the middle of winter, of hiding things inside walls not to forget but to save. One letter read, "I think the house remembers her better than I do now. Sometimes I hear footsteps in the hallway, and they don't frighten me. They just remind me what it felt like to be heard." Another, "I don't know if ghosts are real, but I hope if I become one, this is where I'll stay." The girl read every word in silence. Each letter peeled back a layer of time she hadn't realized the house carried. She thought it began with Thorn, then with Aloan. Now she knew it went far deeper. This house had always been a witness, not to grand events, but to people. People who folded letters with shaking hands and hid them in floorboards and whispered into mirrors and left books open mid-sentence. People who loved softly and suffered privately and survived or didn't, but always left something behind. She carefully returned the letters to the box and placed it atop the writing desk beside the others. Labeled it before. That night, she added her own letter to the stack, not because she was ready to be remembered, but because she understood the weight of being unwritten. It read, "I am part of the story now. I don't know how long I'll stay, but while I do, I will keep the house listening. I will carry every word that came before me. And maybe someday, someone will read this and feel a little less alone." She signed it with just an initial A. Years pass again, not quickly, not slowly, just softly. The girl, who never once told the house her full name, stayed longer than anyone expected, including herself. She watched seasons turn to the same lace-curtained windows Aloan once sat behind. She wore slippers down the same stairs Thorn once drifted through. And she sang quietly to herself in the attic, where the air still carried echoes of someone who had once written poems to ghosts. She grew into herself, not dramatically, just truthfully. She began journaling late at night, at the same desk where Aloan left her letters. Only, she didn't write about her day or her dreams. She wrote about the house, its size, its silence, the way the sunlight always struck the banister at 3:17 p.m. She wrote down stories of those who had come before, of Thorn, of Aloan, of R, and the missing sister, of the man who had stayed for only 3 days but wept in the parlor as if it had been his home in another life. One day, she copied every letter, old and new, into a thick, linen-bound notebook. She didn't edit a word. She didn't embellish. She simply recorded. When she reached the final page, she wrote, "This house does not belong to me, but it held me, and in return, I leave behind this story, so that whoever comes next may know they are never truly alone." She titled the book, "The House on Wren Street," and she did not sign it. She packed a small bag, folded one sweater, one brush, her notebook, a photograph of the front porch at sunrise, and then, one late spring morning, she opened the door and stepped into the mist. No one saw her go, but when the next visitor arrived, an older woman carrying a map with no markings and a heart full of unnamed sorrow, the door was already unlocked. There was tea waiting on the stove. There was a candle lit in the hallway, and on the writing desk, beside a smooth river stone and a single pressed violet, was a copy of the book, open to the first page. The house was still. Then it breathed. The story had not ended. It had begun again. The house remained still for many weeks after she left. Not abandoned, not asleep, just listening. The teacup remained on the table. The last letter remained folded beside a dried violet. No one swept the steps. No one replaced the candle. But the house did not sag. It did not creak. It waited. Then, one rainy evening, a child arrived. Alone. No suitcase. No shoes. Just a bright yellow raincoat and a gaze like stormlight, old and wide and unafraid. She didn't knock. The door opened before her fingers touched it. She stepped inside and stood in the threshold for a long time, dripping quietly onto the floorboards. "I heard you calling," she said softly. The house made no sound, but the fireplace flared to life. She walked room to room, stopping here and there, touching a worn armchair, tilting her head at the painting in the hallway, running her fingers across the dusty spines of books. She said nothing, but everything about her movement suggested she knew exactly where she was, exactly who the house had once held, exactly what it still offered. She curled up in a window seat with a thick blanket and opened the book left on the desk. The House on Wren Street. She read the first page, then the second, then the third. When she reached the final chapter, she didn't close the book. She added a page, tore one from the back of her journal, and wrote in round, careful letters, "I'm not sure what I am yet, but I think I'm meant to listen to." She placed it between the pages like a seed. That night, a soft draft passed through the house, not cold, just present, and the mirror, untouched for years, fogged with a single word: welcome. Because some stories do not end with death, and some houses are not haunted. They are homes for the ones who hear the world too closely, who love without asking, who speak to walls and expect an answer. The house on Wren Street had become more than a story. It had become a keeper. And now it had found the next,